Hello, friends and others. It is me, Empyrean Serpent, and I am here today with the top 100 metal releases from 2019, which is, as of the time of recording, last year. I will be briefly going through what I thought were all the highest quality releases from the year, and detailing a little bit about them, and going into more detail for some of the ones higher up on the list. And as someone who listened to at least over 500 metal albums and EPs from the year, I think I have a pretty good sense for this one. That being said, of course, it's likely that I missed some stuff, so if your favorite albums aren't on here, feel free to comment them below, since I almost definitely have not listened to all of them. And while you're here, feel free to subscribe to the channel for tons more metal music related content, as well as occasional video game related stuff. But without further ado, let us get right into it. Starting off right at number 100, we have Hideous Divinity with Simulacrum. These guys are a pretty great, brutal, and technical death metal band, and this album is certainly a fun listen. Quality riffs and great intensity throughout, quite an enjoyable time overall, and definitely in the top tier of brutal technical death metal for the year. Next at 99, we have Carthagods with The Monster in Me. Now, this one is a very riffy, progressive power metal album with some heavier moments, both musically and emotionally. There's also some pretty good symphonic use overall, though it's not too predominant. Definitely on the darker side of power metal, and the performances and songwriting on here are pretty great. For number 98, we have an EP by Illusion Force titled Alive. It's a small release, which is pretty reminiscent of their full length overall, all in the same style of some very melodic J-power, and it's a pretty fun time. Great melodies, catchy songwriting, good performances all around. While I wouldn't say it's quite near the quality of the aforementioned album, it still has enjoyable and catchy tracks as you would hope. Pretty good time overall. 97 brings us the Strategy of Chaos by Antonello Giliberto, which is an instrumental neoclassical power metal album with a good focus on shredding, but the compositions on this thing are a lot stronger than I would expect from most standard shred albums. The neoclassical elements as well as the symphonic elements on here are incorporated really well and build up more of an atmosphere than you would expect, plus the shredding on here is really top tier. Great album overall. At 96, we have Anathema by Desecravity, which is another brutal technical death metal album, and very intense at that. Some pretty great atmosphere on this thing, and it gets very fast, technical, and crazy pretty quick. There's some great use of dissonance and dizzying riffs and leads, and it definitely channels more chaos than most brutal technical death metal bands tend to, which definitely makes for a great listen. It also shreds pretty hard. Nice time overall. Ranked at 95 is the Arising by Zac Leaser, which is more of a melodic technical death metal album, though this particular release tends to have a more emotive atmosphere than you would normally expect from the genre, which actually evokes some pretty nice emotion. All the performances are great, tons of top-tier shredding, great melodies. It's a really fun listen. After that, at 94, we have Desert Near the End with Of Fire and Stars. We're a fairly intense power thrash band with quite a few tendencies towards mellow death. Lots of thrashier, speedy riffing with some great intensity and a very predominant use of harsh vocals on this thing. On top of that, some pretty catchy melodies here and there, so quite the nice blend overall. For 93, we have Monomyth by Age of Artemis, which is some great melodic power metal, though with a few progressive touches here and there. It's also quite a great exemplar in terms of melodic power metal, with tons of very catchy and uplifting melodies, and overall very enjoyable compositions, and on top of that, quite a nice variety to the sound and said compositions. Really good release for sure. At 92, we have Twisted Tower Dire with Wars in the Unknown, and these guys are more of a USPM, trad power metal styled band, which means this does generally sound pretty in line with traditional heavy metal, but with more focus on the melodies and speed, which for this band works really well. There's some great catchy songwriting on here with quality vocals, quality riffs, and great melodies overall. Really fun album for sure. For 91, we have Tales of a New Century by Fugatta, which is some pretty great symphonic power metal. They tend to incorporate a lot of lighter, more floaty orchestral elements akin to what you'd expect from bands like Angra or Aquaria, with the melodies to fit. There's also some nice variety in the vocals here, and overall some pretty good performances and songwriting all around. quite a catchy release for sure. At number 90, we have Welcome to Paradise by NorthTale, which is also some pretty great symphonic power metal, and coincidentally has a fairly similar feel to that of the last album mentioned, though with seemingly a bit more neoclassical sound in there, a la Stradivarius-esque influence. Very catchy vocals and compositions overall, great production as well, and great performances too. A really good album. In 89, we have Ankor with White Dragon, and this one honestly even surprises me a little bit since this album is more of an alternative metal release with a decent amount of varied influence, generally taking on more poppy characteristics. However, everything is integrated surprisingly well together, and on top of that, the overall composition here is surprisingly strong, which is certainly not something you would expect out of what you would assume to be a more commercialized sound. In any case, this thing has great melodies, some surprisingly good riffs, quality vocals, and is overall a very fun album. For the first black metal release on this list, at number 88, we have Undir skyggðarhaldi, hopefully I'm enunciating that correctly, from Andavald, and this particular release is some pretty atmospheric black metal at that. The mood of this thing is very bleak and dark, giving off quite a brooding vibe to the music, and the songwriting certainly shows off a more somber and dense tendency, which makes for a very emotive listen, and one that I find is a bit more unique to black metal than most other albums. Though to truly get why I would say that, I would probably have to write out a full review, or you would have to just check out the album yourself, which I highly recommend. So after that, at 87, we have Diviner with Realms of Time, a much more straightforward, power thrashy album that leans more into trad heavy metal influence quite a bit of the time. And through all the heavier riffs and songwriting on this thing, there is absolutely a very catchy dose of quality, catchy melodies, especially amidst the vocals. As mentioned, it is by no means a super complex musical statement, but it is certainly a very enjoyable listen. Coming after that is Noveria at 86 with the album Aequilibrium. With a slightly more progressive take on the thrashier side of power metal, this thing immediately carries over with quite a distinct heaviness, though that intensity is very well tempered by the beautiful and rather atmospheric melodies we get on here, which are rather reminiscent of Symphony X, I would say. Despite that, this thing does tend to have more straightforwardly structured songs, definitely maximizing the more power metal-y side of song structure with making the songs impactful and catchy, which definitely works quite well here. Really good album. Then at 85, we get Denis Shvarts with Dreamology, which is an instrumental, progressive, technical death metal album, and if the name does not ring a bell, this guy is the guitarist for Dark Matter Secret. In any case, this release here is pretty damn great, with a ton of more interesting moments in the composition, as well as lots of great shredding and solid riffing. The songwriting is overall quite enthralling, and this thing certainly stays fresh in regards to the compositional variety here. Overall, a very fun release, and definitely one of the more entertaining instrumental metal albums out there. Moving on to 84, we have Scarlet Vale with Metamorphosis, and this here is a J-Power release with a bit more diversity than you would normally expect, since not only do they pull off some pretty great symphonic usage with some neoclassical influence, this thing has a lot more of a melodeath leaning than you would see from a lot of other J-Power of the sort, and it certainly pulls it off quite well, managing to keep up with all the great melodies you'd expect from top-tier J-Power, but going even further and delivering a lot more intensity than you would expect on top of that. If you're a J-Power fan, then this is absolutely a recommended listen. After that, we have Vandor with In the Land of Vandor at number 83, a power metal release that reminds me a bit of Rhapsody if Rhapsody decided to replace their neoclassical elements with more standard power metal elements. Though with all the high quality solos on here from both the guitar and the keyboards, it does push that similarity up further. In any instance, some very fantasy-based power metal with some great melodies, excellent guitar work, and catchy songwriting, as well as some fairly catchy vocals. Furthermore, the bass presence on this album is pretty surprising, since it's a lot more common than in most power metal, especially of this sort, and there are some surprisingly beautiful moments on this thing too. At number 82, we have Jeff Hugel's Sleep Deprivation, which is an instrumental progressive technical death metal album from the man who is presumably best well known for being the bassist of 6 Feet Under. And the stark contrast between these two projects is almost hilarious, especially considering how genuinely great this album is. This thing is rife with tons of catchy and fairly intense and varied songwriting, as well as quite a few great displays of technical skill throughout. It's a very fun and interesting listen, which is a lot more than I can say for the related band. Definitely a surprising release here, and a very strong one at that. For 81, we have Demons in the Dark by Witchlords, which is definitely one of the least modern sounding albums on this list. This thing is some very interesting stuff, very thrashy power metal with a definite lean into more traditional power metal, very akin to stuff like Gamma Ray and early Blind Guardian, and the production is very bedroom mixy at that. The vocals on here are very fitting to the sound, and the guitars have such a predominance to them on here with their tone. The real draw in, though, of course, is the songwriting on this thing. Pretty much every track on here is catchy as hell, and very, very to the point at that. I certainly find myself wishing that some of the songs on here were a bit longer, but either way, it's an amazing release. At 80, we have The Atlantic from Evergrey, a very well-known progressive power metal band, and for good reason it would seem, since not only is this release fairly rife with catchy moments and solid riffs, the atmosphere and emotion that this album invokes are particularly something, as the music here feels strangely personal and very, very emotive, which is a great feat to accomplish when considering the more straightforward songwriting style for a prog power band. Certainly a very impactful album. At 79, we have another very well-known band with Avantasia and their newest release, Moonglow, and this album is about what one would expect from Avantasia at that, a nice blend of power metal and hard rock with some symphonic and progressive leanings to it, with overall a very rock opera-esque vibe, which it achieves pretty well. There are a ton of standout tracks on here with some amazing guest vocals and beautiful writing, and there are a few more forgettable moments as well as in-betweens, but in spite of those less memorable times, it is overall still a great release with some very amazing songs. At number 78, we have Opera Magna with Del Amor y Otros Demonios, which hopefully I didn't misenunciate as well. This album is technically a combination of 3 EPs that they had released up until now, with the final EP being released in 2019 as well, so it's a bit of a weird case, but I still think it constitutes for the list. In any case, it is a fairly spectacular symphonic power metal release with some occasional neoclassical elements, though overall it goes very in on the orchestral portions of the album, as they are extremely well done and interwoven beautifully with the rest of the music. I would definitely say that if you're a symphonic power metal fan, this is practically a must-listen. The melodies on here are fantastic, composition is great, overall a very quality release. For number 77, we have Continuum Fracture by Orion Child, which was a bit of a surprise for me, since not only have I never heard the band before, but the style they play is rather interesting, having some elements of power thrash and melodeath while carrying some progressive tendencies on top of that, with some really top-tier guitar work here and there. And I'm going to kind of lead off of a term that Eternity's End has coined a little bit, and call this release very in line with technical power metal, especially considering how technically intensive some of the playing on this thing can get. It's quite an impressive release from that standpoint alone, and the songwriting is pretty great on top of that, with some high-quality riffs and melodies, as well as some great shredding on here. Pretty underrated album as well, in my opinion. At number 76, we get West of Hell with Blood of the Infidel, a very nice and fairly varied release that takes from trad power metal, thrash, heavy metal, bits of progressive and extreme metal, overall a decent bit of diversity to the sound, but it all blends together very cohesively. On top of that, the vocals on here are just as varied and interesting, I would say, which is always a nice time. Either way, this thing has some great riffs, some surprisingly lovely melodies now and then, and is fairly intense, but more importantly, very catchy. Quite a quality release overall. At 75, we have Mardelas with Ground Zero, a fairly short and varied J-Power EP with some great catchy melodies, surprisingly top-tier riffing, strong driving vocals, and some really nice compositional diversity. The band blends in some more trad power metal elements in their sound, which definitely helps with the intensity present here too. Again, a decent bit more so than you'd see in most J-Power. Not a lot else to say about this thing aside from the fact that it is a very fun listen, and despite the short length, there is a lot to get out of this release. Next we have Matin Row Opera with Human Dignity for the 74th position on this list, slightly more well-known J-Power band, and they've definitely got a lot more of a J-Rock vibe to their sound on top of that, with some symphonic inclusions as well. which overall makes for some incredibly catchy tracks and some really damn good melodies. This release is very catchy and quite difficult not to sing along to, quite frankly. It is certainly a very fun time, as one would expect. At 73, we have a self-titled album by the band No One Knows What the Dead Think. This one is pretty much just straight up grindcore, albeit a bit more technically nuanced than you would expect from the genre. It is fast, very intense, has some very high quality riffs, as well as some relatively memorable moments throughout. Overall, it's a very solid release with a great sound to it. For number 72, we get Confessions by Mary's Blood, another J-Power album with more trad heavy metal and J-rock vibes to it, and thanks to this, it feels really strong. This, of course, is helped by the driving and relatively heavy riffs, the prominent bass, and the very powerful vocals on this thing, the only thing really inhibiting that being how low the guitar is in the mix. That aside, though, this thing manages to blend some really beautiful melodies in with that classic brand of heaviness, and it definitely works wonders. Great release here. At 71, we have Zeus, Legends Never Die by Jupiter, which is, again, some more J-Power, believe it or not, and another fairly popular band at that, this time with some present symphonic and neoclassical influences, as well as a bit of trad power metal influence throughout that, especially notable with the new vocalist on the album, who is pretty damn good. Considering the band shares quite a few members with Versailles, the performances on here are extremely tight, and the songwriting is pretty fantastic with tons of very memorable moments. On top of that, the production here is pretty great, everything blends together very well. Really good release overall. For number 70, we get Spiritual Deception with Edamananki, and I'm still like 95% sure that this band's name is a Spawn of Possession reference, especially considering the sound is quite similar. Needless to say, this EP is some pretty spicy technical death metal, leaning into more brutal and progressive aspects at times, and on top of that, having quite a spooky atmosphere overall. The riffing, leads, and atmosphere on this thing are all spectacular, and the same goes for the performances here. Definitely a band I would be looking out for whenever they decide to actually release a full album. Next up, we have a pretty nice entry to the list, the Solace of Ancient Earth by Pythia at number 69. This release is some pretty top-tier symphonic power metal, fairly reminiscent of Nightwish, with some surprisingly great riffing and amazing melodies, and the vocals on this thing are absolutely stellar. The symphonics are implemented pretty perfectly, and this thing manages to get through a pretty great sense of intensity and emotion. Very quality release, and definitely much better than what you'd get out of modern Nightwish, I would say. At 68, we have Vale of Pnath with Accursed. This EP is first surprisingly long for an EP, and secondly, some really good technical death metal. The overall dark atmosphere, frequent tremolos, and screechy vocals on this album make it a bit more reminiscent of black metal than most tech death, and the riffs and leads are pretty damn great on this thing, showing some great intensity as well as some pretty quality melodies here and there. Very nice EP overall. For 67, there is Human by Darkwater, a progressive power metal album that is fairly heavy on the progressive aspects and to quite great effect, I would say. There are a ton of beautiful moments and lovely progressions on this album, which only benefit greatly from the melodic nature of the power metal blended in, and there is a very present emotional intensity to the album that intertwines wonderfully with the atmosphere. The album is definitely a joy to listen to and has some very, very catchy moments on top of that. Very fun time. At 66, we have another power metal band, though this time with a bit more straightforward power metal sound to it, although with some interesting, slightly more synthy additions at moments, and that release is Empty Eyes by Seven Kingdoms. Although a relatively short EP, this thing has some very strong riffs and strong melodies, great performances, and some very catchy songwriting overall, which leads to a very fun listen. For 65, we have Crossvein with True Castle, and this very short little EP right here is packed with intensity. Some fairly high-tempo J-power with great symphonic and neoclassical use. The songwriting on this distinctly reminds me of Unlucky Morpheus, which is a great thing considering how much I love that band. The riffs on here are fast, catchy, relatively intense. The melodies are absolutely wonderful and driving and fairly uplifting and catchy as well, and all the elements on here feel like they blend together wonderfully. Quality performances too, overall a lovely EP, only really hampered by the fact that it's so short. At number 64, we have one of the more indirect forms of weeb metal that I have seen, Master Sword with The Final Door. Being a Legend of Zelda based band, the lyrics and music itself does draw influence from the series, which I would say is a good thing if you're a fan of the games, since that is an instant draw-in, and in general leads for some very cool compositions that you don't normally tend to get out of power metal, considering the melodies used. The riffing on here is generally pretty great, the leads tend to be even better, and the vocals on here are fantastic. Very fun release overall, with some especially standout moments throughout. Number 63 brings us Grimgots with Dragons of the Ages, and this is some pretty great fantasy-themed symphonic power metal if I have ever seen any. Very orchestrally involved compositions, the band makes use of a variety of different vocalists on here, so even if there isn't an absurd amount of complexity to the songwriting, everything feels very layered and multifaceted, whilst remaining super catchy and not too incomprehensible, which is a pretty great feat and something that I think more power metal, symphonic power metal in particular, should take after. In any case, the songwriting here is absurdly catchy and the performances are all great. Very nice album for sure. At 62, we have Spellcrying Machine by Essence of Datum, and this thing is a pretty spectacular instrumental album, being along the lines of progressive, technical, melodic death metal at that. And trust me when I say that all of the above is blended practically perfectly into a beautiful instrumental album here, with a seemingly very focused vision at that. The riffs on this thing are pretty varied and thus harder to describe under a catch-all, but they all tend to be extremely memorable, and the same can more or less be said for the melodies here. The performances are absolutely great, tons of technicality on here with some great emotive playing from the lead lines, especially when taking into account the shredding that goes on. Overall, definitely one of the best instrumental albums from last year. For number 61, we have Lotus by Soen, a progressive metal album that I can assume is fairly popular from what I've seen at least. As far as the sound goes, it's got similarities to Tool and the non-death metal side of Opeth, though not necessarily their modern day output, mind you. And they do it pretty well at that. These guys certainly know how to write some very memorable songs with very interesting portions. The percussion and keyboards in particular being pretty intriguing on this thing, with some surprisingly great vocals for the genre and some pretty solid riffs and leads throughout. And that is all I will cover for this video. If you have any thoughts on my decisions here, leave a comment below. If you want to check out any of these albums, I will have links in the description. And if you enjoyed your time, feel free to leave a like and subscribe, not only for similar content centered around high-quality metal music, but more of this list right here, since I will be uploading the rest of this quite soon. Also, feel free to follow my social media. I'm not extremely active there, but I do post more updates and whatnot. And if you want to interact with me outside of YouTube, then those are some pretty quick and easy solutions to that. I have been Empyrean Serpent, and thank you very much for your time.